On the show today, two constitutional government groups are launching an ad campaign to counter $1 million in left-wing spending that is meant to confuse and trick you on the two referendum questions that you're going to see on the August ballot. So we'll talk with Rick Esenberg of Will, because Will and the Institute for Reforming Government are launching a six-figure ad campaign to counter the confusion here and make it clear a yes vote on both of those questions is the vote that's, in favor of some oversight on how federal money is spent and how our taxpayer dollars are spent. So we'll talk with him. I've been talking about the two referendum questions that Wisconsin voters will be seeing on the August 13th primary ballot. They pertain to who in state government should be involved in deciding how non-specific federal funding that's dumped onto the state is then spent. This comes after Governor Evers essentially created a political slush fund for himself with some of the federal money that flowed in during COVID. It was spent on other things, doled out in dribs and drabs on projects that he found worthy or could, in my opinion, help buy him some votes. So Republicans have two constitutional questions on the ballot that would change that and give the legislature shared control over the decision-making on how that money is spent. That is left-wing groups spending at least $1 million trying to trick voters into voting no on these questions, when the vote should be a yes if you're in favor of more responsible government and taxpayer oversight. Joining me to talk about it is Rick Esenberg, the president of Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty, which is joining with another pro-constitutional government organization, the Institute for Responsible Government, in an effort to fight the left's intentional confusion on this issue. Good morning, sir. How are you?
Morning, Jay. How are you? Thanks for having me.
I'm doing well. Let's start with what you and IRG are doing here. You're involved. What is your effort involved? What will you be doing over the next 3 weeks or so before we hit that August 13th primary?
Well, we're going to be engaging in an educational program to inform the public about these amendments and what they really do and why they are important. So there will be some broadcast communications, digital media, things of that character in order to get the word out. Because, the opponents of this amendment, and there's a group that calls themselves Protect Our Constitution, which largely consists of special interests who want this unilaterally controlled largesse to continue, are getting it exactly wrong. Our Constitution, both on the federal and the state level, are designed out of a mistrust of the concentration of power. And so we have checks and balances. We have separation of powers to get consensus. And what's happening here is that the governor is being allowed to accept, federal monies and then spend them however he wants, with no input from the legislature. And that's inconsistent with our Constitution, which vests the legislative power solely in the Assembly and the Senate. They have to appropriate money for the governor to spend it. And this is being, this important constitutional limitation is being sidetracked by, this scheme of the federal government taxing money from the people of this state, bringing it to Washington, taking a little slice for themselves, and then sending them back for unilateral distribution by a friendly governor.
Yeah, and the way it's wrong, no matter which side of the political aisle is doing it, which is why I've been characterizing this as to me, it's not even a partisan issue. But the figure that we're working with when it comes to Governor Evers, the thing that really touched this off was this massive flood of COVID spending that was just shocking. We're talking about Governor Evers spending at least $5 billion in federal COVID funds without any input from the legislature. And, a lot of it went to COVID relief, yes, but a good chunk of it also went to pet projects or special interest projects that he supported. Do you have examples of that you're going to be putting out today?
Oh, sure. I mean, there was money spent on soccer stadiums. There was money spent on all sorts of minor things. But then there was a lot of money that was directed to groups like Planned Parenthood or other entities that where Evers could expect to find support. And I think it's a very important point you made, Jay, that this isn't just a partisan issue. I mean, any governor given this authority is going to act politically. And so I think that one of the points that we want to make with our partners at the Institute for Reforming Government is that everybody should support this, because nobody should want this much authority to be vested in the governor. Because even if you like Tony Evers, even if you love what he did with that $5 billion, I guarantee you that there will be, at some point in the future, federal government that is controlled by the party that you don't like, and a governor whose decisions you will not support, right? Not that long ago, Donald Trump was president and Scott Walker was governor, and the people that loved Tony Evers did not love them. And so we all have, I think, a common interest in these checks and balances, the separation of powers that requires consensus and multiple points of input and diminishes the concentration of power in one person.
That's right, and that's why
Governor Evers is not our king. Governor Walker was not our king. The legislature needs to be involved
here, and that's why the vote on both of these questions would be yes if you're in favor of what we're talking about here, because the simplest litmus tests is just flipping things around. Left-wing organizations like Planned Parenthood were getting a bunch of this money with no oversight or no clear connection to how this related to COVID. Can you imagine the media outrage if Scott Walker, a Republican governor, had done that? The double standard here is clear, and it illustrates how and why these referendum questions really aren't political. If you're in favor of sound governmental practices and oversight, if you're in favor of ensuring your tax money is being spent responsibly and fairly, you'd want to vote yes on these questions. I mean, is that partisan?
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, as opposed to the allegations that are being made that this is somehow undermining our Constitution, I think that what's happening with these two amendments is an attempt to reaffirm and restore our constitutional separation of powers. It's to make sure that we have the widest democratic input in these decisions about how to spend what could be, as you point out, billions of dollars. And it was intended that the legislature have a say in the expenditure of monies by the state of Wisconsin, and these amendments will restore that and reaffirm what I think our Constitution has always required. The governor executes the law. Legislature makes the law. It requires action by both of them in order to spend public funds.
We're talking with Rick Esenberg of the Wisconsin Institute of Law and Liberty. One thing I didn't know is that apparently at least 35 states have some joint decision-making here involving both governor and legislature when it comes to funding like this. Do we know why Wisconsin doesn't?
I think a long time ago the legislature passed a law which purported to give broad power to the governor to just spend whatever money that the federal government might provide to him. Now, I think that law is in and of itself unconstitutional. I think that's an unconstitutional delegation of authority. But the question is unclear given the court's past precedents, and so I think that what we need to do. Because the legislature acted in that way and because the courts have not firmly stood up for a limitation on the legislature's delegation of power is to pass these amendments to ensure that our original understanding and the understanding that prevails in 34 additional states will be the law in Wisconsin, and then we will maximize democratic input and preserve our constitutional separation of powers.
So address our opponent's main claim here, if you will. Their claim here is making these changes that gets the legislature involved in the decision-making in the time of an emergency is going to slow down a governor when he or she needs to deal with that crisis. Would it?
Look, there's no guarantee that a governor will act expeditiously in response to a crisis. At some point, we have to trust our elected officials to do the right thing. And if you remember what happened in the wake of COVID, the legislature did act very quickly. I think we had a bipartisan COVID Relief Act passed in the state of Wisconsin. I think it was in April of 2020. So this was expeditiously. Certainly the governor will continue to have power to act emergently until the legislature can get together. But once the legislature can get together, and they will get together if this is truly an emergency, then we can return to regular constitutional order. And so I think if you look at the COVID pandemic itself, the legislature did act. Now, it's not an objection to say that the legislature won't do exactly what I want. That's democracy. Our government doesn't always do what we want because we don't always have the votes in order to get our way.
I don't think I'd have a show if the government always did what we want.
There's no reason to expect the legislature will be irresponsible.
Yeah, I think you're right. So just to put a bow around it, given that mail-in ballots are already out, in-person early voting starts next Tuesday, what's your message for confused voters as they do see these confusing? They always write them in a confusing manner. What's your message for voters when they do see these confusing questions?
Yeah, they're written in legalese, but I think that the answer for voters is simple. Vote yes on both amendments.
Here. So Rick Esenberg, president of Will, I wanted to ask you about one other thing, or at least give you kudos. Kudos to your lawmakers at Will for getting the DNR to change a rule on fishermen not being able to have a firearm with them as they fish. Not to shoot the fish, but to have it for protection or have it for for any other reason they might need it. It will challenge the rule on behalf of fishermen that the Wisconsin DNR has been following, and Governor Evers' DNR relented without even a real legal fight on this one, right, this week?
Yeah. I mean, the rule was overreach, and I think once again, Jay, you've put me in the position of getting to take credit for the work done by my wonderful colleagues. And they did a great job on this, and they stopped something that was really kind of silly.
Yeah, Rick Esenberg, the president of Will. Thanks for joining me. His organization is partnering with the Institute for Reforming Government and spending six figures on advertising, mailers, TV, radio to get out the truth about these two referendum questions on the August ballot. Another very important mission. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Jay. Take care.
It is 8:42 again. Just a reminder, too, yes votes mean more responsible, more representative, and more constitutional government. So it's too bad we have to break it down this way, and I never want to tell people how to vote. But the left has started an early campaign here to try to intentionally confuse people on these two questions and what they mean. And, of course, that's easier because they are written in legalese and they're confusing. So if you just come across them on the ballot cold and you try to read these things and decipher what they mean and, well, I got that mailer that was telling me to vote no. And if you're in favor of responsible constitutional government, the votes on both, the way you'd vote on both of these questions is yes.